He was 6'8" and 300 pounds of controlled chaos. A wild-eyed madman who swung a length of chain through the smoke of arenas on 3 different continents. In Japan, they treated him like a god. In Puerto Rico, they filled stadiums just to watch him bleed. He was, by any honest measure, one of the most feared and one of the most beloved brawlers the business had ever produced. A man who bowed to no promoter, signed no exclusive contract, and answered to absolutely no one. And in a little under 48 hours, he would be dead, stabbed to death in a shower stall by a man he was supposed to trust, in a room full of other wrestlers who could do nothing but watch. His name was Bruiser Brody. The tense, sweltering days on a Caribbean island where a business dispute curdled into something monstrous. We're going to trace the exact sequence of events that led one of wrestling's biggest stars into that locker room in Bayamon. The bad blood that had been simmering for years. The private conversation that was never really about business. And the botched, chaotic, almost unbelievable aftermath that let a killer walk free. Because what happened to Bruiser Brody on the night of July 16th, 1988, wasn't just a tragedy, it was a betrayal. And by the time we're done, you'll understand why, decades later, the men who were in that room still can't talk about it without their voices cracking. The world knew the character. The wild man. The lunatic in the fur-covered boots who charged the ring like a hurricane, making landfall, roaring at the crowd, swinging that chain over his head with reckless abandon. Fans in Tokyo and San Juan and St. Louis screamed his name. Promoters shook when they saw him coming. Because Bruiser Brody looked like a man who could genuinely hurt you. And in the ring, sometimes, he did. But the character was a costume. Underneath it was Frank Donald Goodish, born in 1946, a former sports writer out of San Antonio, Texas. An articulate, sharp, calculating man who had played college football before a Texas wrestling promoter named Fritz von Erich spotted him and gave him a new name and a new life. Frank was intelligent in a way that made promoters nervous. He read contracts, he understood leverage. He knew exactly what he was worth, and he refused to accept $1 less. That was the thing that made Brody different from almost everyone else in his era. He was an independent contractor in the truest sense of the phrase. While other stars signed their names to exclusive deals and did what they were told, Brody kept himself free. He worked where he wanted, when he wanted, for the money he demanded. In Japan, he was a legend on the level of a national hero, packing arenas alongside his friend Stan Hansen. Across the dying American territories, he was a special attraction who could be brought in to sell out a building and then vanish back into the night. And that independence made him powerful. It also made him a target. Because a man who cannot be controlled is a man who frightens the people whose entire business is control. At home, though, none of that mattered. At home, Frank was a husband and a father. He had married a woman named Barbara, born in New Zealand, whom he'd met while she was working in a hotel in Australia. They had a son, Jeffrey, born in 1980, and by every account from the people who actually knew him, the man his family saw bore no resemblance whatsoever to the monster on television. Barbara would later describe watching him transform in the car on the way to the airport, becoming someone she didn't quite recognize, and then watching him change back the moment he came home. Frank never lost himself in the character. He never confused the wild man with the real one. When his son was born, friends said he changed completely, driven by a single, simple desire: to provide, to build a good life for the boy, to make the sacrifice of his body worth something. That was the man who boarded a plane in the summer of 1988, leaving his home in Texas to work a series of matches on an island where the wrestling business ran hot, wild, and dangerous. He had done it many times before. He had no reason to think this trip would be any different. He was wrong. But before we get to the island, you need to understand exactly what was waiting for him there, and the man whose name would forever be tied to his. By 1988, the American wrestling territories were dying. Vince McMahon's national expansion had swallowed them one by one, gobbling up the regional promotions that had defined the business for half a century. But there was one place that remained a wild, lucrative outlier: the World Wrestling Council in Puerto Rico. Run by Carlos Colon and Victor Jovica, the WWC was known for three things: passionate, borderline feral crowds, matches so bloody they bordered on the grotesque, and big paydays for the foreign stars who were willing to make the trip. Brody had worked the island on and off for years. He was a genuine draw there, a headline attraction who feuded with Abdullah the Butcher and with Carlos Colon himself, drawing enormous crowds to see the giant American get his comeuppance, or dish it out. The fans loved to hate him. The box office numbers proved it. But underneath the success, tension had been building, and the tension was about money. It was always, in the end, about money. Brody felt he was being shortchanged. He believed the promotion owed him significant sums, that the payoffs he was receiving didn't match the crowds he was drawing. And Brody, being Brody, did not suffer that kind of thing quietly. He was not a man who swallowed a bad payoff and smiled. He pushed back. He demanded what he was owed. And in a business built on unspoken hierarchies and the fragile egos of the men who ran it, that made him a problem. Standing at the center of that problem was a man named Jose Huertas Gonzalez. To the fans, he was Invader #1, one of the most popular masked wrestlers in the history of the island. A local hero, a legend to Puerto Rican audiences. But Gonzalez was more than just a performer, he was also the booker. The man who decided the storylines, who won, who lost, who got pushed, and who got buried. In the WWC, that made him one of the most powerful people in the entire operation. He was a gatekeeper. And in the territorial system, the booker's word was very close to law. Here is where the bad blood lived. According to friends of Brody, including the veteran wrestler Dutch Mantell, Brody had little respect for Gonzalez. He viewed him as a stooge for the promoters, a company man, someone doing the office's dirty work. And Brody, who took orders from no one, made his disdain known. He did not hide it. He was not the kind of man who could hide it. There had been history between them too. Years of it. They had wrestled each other before, in matches where Brody, notorious for his stiff and uncooperative style, had reportedly made Gonzalez look weak, had refused to give him what he wanted. There is a term in wrestling for a man who won't cooperate, who won't sell his opponent's offense, who won't lie down when the finish calls for it. He is called uncooperative, difficult, a man who works too stiff. Brody had been all of those things, and to a booker who was also a proud local hero performing in front of his own people, that treatment could feel like a public humiliation. In the insular, pride-soaked world of professional wrestling, where a man's credibility was his only real currency, that kind of humiliation could fester for a very long time. It could turn into resentment. And resentment, left to sit and rot in the heat of a place where everyone knew everyone and nothing was ever truly forgotten, could turn into something far worse. And there was the matter of respect, or the lack of it. Gonzalez was the booker, which meant that in the normal order of things, Brody was supposed to take his direction. He was supposed to follow the plan, do the finish, play his part in the story Gonzalez was telling. But Brody did not follow plans he disagreed with. He never had. To a man used to being obeyed inside his own promotion, in his own country, a foreign star who openly refused his authority was not just an inconvenience. He was a challenge, a standing insult delivered night after night in front of the boys. So this was the situation that awaited Frank Goodish as his plane touched down. A promotion that he believed owed him money, a booker he openly disrespected, and a well of bad feeling that had been years in the making. All of it packed into the cramped, sweltering backstage of a Caribbean stadium. The pieces were all in place. The only thing missing was the moment. The final 48 hours had begun. Wrestlers were arriving on the island for a weekend run of shows. Dutch Mantell, who would later become one of the most important witnesses to what happened, described flying in and making his way to the place where the talent stayed. It was routine, the usual rhythm of the road. Fly in, check in, get to the building, do the job, get paid, go home. These men lived out of suitcases. They knew the drill in their sleep. There was nothing in those first hours to suggest that anything was about to go catastrophically wrong. Brody was around. He talked with the other Americans. He was, by the accounts of those present, in reasonable spirits. Whatever grievances he carried about his pay, he carried them the way he always did, with a kind of stubborn, simmering confidence. This was a man who had faced down promoters all over the world and won. He had no reason to believe he couldn't handle one more dispute on one more island. But something was different this time, something in the air. Some of the men who were there would later say, with the terrible clarity of hindsight, that the atmosphere in that locker room felt wrong. Heavy, charged. Whether that's genuine memory or the mind's tendency to rearrange the past into an ominous shape, we'll never fully know. But what is certain is this: Jose Gonzalez had a knife, and at some point he made the decision to bring it to the building. That single fact hangs over everything, because a man does not carry a hunting knife into a locker room by accident. Whatever else is disputed about that night, and much of it is, the presence of that weapon speaks to something: intent, preparation, a decision made before the confrontation ever began. The show that night was at the Juan Ramon Lubriel Stadium in Bayamon, a city just outside San Juan. It was the kind of venue that told you everything about how big the WWC was on the island. Not a small club, not a high school gym. A stadium, thousands upon thousands of fans, packed in tight, loud, hungry for violence. The heat was oppressive, the humidity thick enough to wear. And backstage, in a cramped and crowded locker room, the wrestlers laced their boots and prepared for another night of controlled mayhem. Brody was scheduled to work a match against Dan Spivey, a big, powerful American wrestler. It was a solid marquee bout, the kind of thing Brody had done 1,000 times. He sat in the locker room, according to those present, lacing up, going about his pre-match routine. Just another night at the office for the most independent man in the business. The locker room was full. Tony Atlas was there, the former Mr. USA, a genuine powerhouse. Dutch Mantel was there. A young Sione Vailahi, who the world would later come to know as the Barbarian, was there. Local talent mixed with the visiting Americans in the tight, humid space. Carlos Colon, the promoter, was present, and Jose Gonzalez, the booker, the man with the knife, moved through the room like he belonged there. Because he did. And then Gonzalez approached Brody, and he asked him if they could talk. In private. This in itself was not alarming. Not at all. In a locker room that cramped, with that many bodies packed into that little space, the shower area was the only place two men could go to speak without a dozen sets of ears listening in. It was normal. It was, in fact, the most natural thing in the world. Two men with a business dispute, stepping away to hash it out man to man. That was how things were supposed to be done. That was the code. So Brody stood up. He draped a towel over his shoulder. And he followed Jose Gonzalez toward the showers, walking, without knowing it, toward the last conversation of his life. What happened in that shower stall in those next few seconds is the one part of this story that no one will ever fully know. Because of the way the room was built, because of where the two men were standing, there was no clear, unobstructed view. The men in the locker room heard it before they saw it. They heard a scuffle, a commotion, and then they heard the screams, two of them, loud enough to cut through the noise of the entire locker room, loud enough that every man in that space froze where he stood. Tony Atlas was the first to move. Atlas, a powerhouse who feared very little in this world, ran toward the sound, and what he saw when he reached the shower would stay with him for the rest of his life. Bruiser Brody, the invincible monster, the 6'8" wild man who had terrorized arenas across the globe, was bent over, hunched, clutching at his stomach. And standing across from him, Atlas saw Jose Gonzalez, holding a knife. Atlas would later describe the details in a way that makes your blood run cold. He talked about seeing the blade come down. He talked about wrapping his own arm around Brody's waist to try to protect him, to keep the knife away from his throat, and about the blade coming down anyway and slicing clean through Brody's long ponytail. He talked about Carlos Colon pinning Gonzalez against the wall, shouting at him to stop, saying his name over and over, and he talked about Brody. About the giant, folding, wounded, saying something that Atlas found almost unbearably strange. Brody did not ask them not to hurt him. He asked them not to hurt him anymore. Them, not him. As if, in that moment of shock and blood loss, Brody's mind had gone somewhere the rest of them couldn't follow. The knife had done catastrophic damage. Brody had been stabbed in the torso, the blade tearing into his abdomen. Atlas, kneeling over him, could see the wound on his chest bubbling, and he understood with a sick lurch what that meant. A lung had been opened. The big man was in desperate, mortal trouble. The other wrestlers, some of them, moved to separate Gonzalez from the scene. A wrestler known as TNT, who years later would become famous in the WWE as Savio Vega, was among those who helped pull Gonzalez away. Slowly, the chaos of the immediate attack gave way to a different kind of horror. The horror of a man bleeding out on a locker room floor, and the growing realization that help was very, very far away. Because here is where the tragedy of Bruiser Brody stops being a story about a knife and becomes a story about everything that failed him afterward. Frank Goodish did not have to die that night. The wounds were severe, catastrophic even, but he was a mountain of a man in the prime physical condition of a professional athlete. With fast, competent medical care, there was a real chance he could have survived. But fast, competent medical care was exactly what he did not receive. The problem started with the ambulance. It took an agonizingly long time to arrive. Estimates from the men who were there range from 45 minutes to a full hour. And the reason was cruel in its ordinariness. The stadium was packed with thousands of fans. Outside, the roads were choked with traffic, cars jammed bumper to bumper in the humid Puerto Rican night. The ambulance simply could not get through. So while a man bled on the floor, precious minutes ticked away. Then more minutes. Then more. Tony Atlas refused to leave his side. He stayed with Brody, doing what he could, applying pressure, trying to keep the big man conscious and calm. And as he did, Brody spoke to him. Not about revenge. Not about the man who had done this to him. He talked about his family. He asked Atlas to take care of his wife and his kids. Over and over, the thing on his mind was not himself. It was the people he was afraid he was about to leave behind. Think about that for a moment. A man lying on a concrete floor, his life pouring out of him, and the only thing he can think to say is a plea for the people he loves. Not a word of anger, not a curse for the man who had done this to him. Just his wife and his children held in his mind above everything else, even his own survival. That is not the wild man. That is not the character. That is Frank Goodish. The father, the husband, the man behind the costume, showing everyone, in the worst possible moment, exactly who he really was. When the ambulance finally arrived, the ordeal was not over. The paramedics, by the accounts of those present, were not equipped to handle a man of Brody's enormous size. Atlas reportedly had to help lift him, had to help carry the giant out of the locker room and get him loaded. And then the ambulance had to fight its way back through that same wall of traffic, that same crush of fans and cars, every second of the delay stealing another sliver of Brody's chances. They took him to the Centro Medico Hospital, and even there the nightmare continued. The staff was overwhelmed. Brody needed emergency surgery to repair the devastating internal damage, the wounds to his intestines and his liver. Dutch Mantell and Tony Atlas went to the hospital to wait, to pray, to hope. And Mantell would recount a detail that breaks the heart all over again. He remembered seeing Brody lying on a gurney in the hallway, still conscious, still hanging on. And still, even then, asking about his wife and his son. Frank Goodish held on through the night. He fought the way he had fought his entire life. But the damage was too great and the help had come too late. In the early hours of the morning of July 17, 1988, on the operating table, Bruiser Brody died. He was 42 years old. Far away, in the middle of the night, a telephone rang in a home in Texas. Barbara Goodish was woken by the sound. On the other end was Nancy, the wife of Carlos Colon, telling her that she needed to come to Puerto Rico. In the fog of those first terrible hours, the word that reached her was that there had been an accident. An accident, as if the knife had somehow found its own way into her husband's body, as if no one had been holding it. But it was not an accident. And what happened next, in the days and months and years that followed, would turn a horrifying tragedy into something that many in the wrestling world consider an outright miscarriage of justice. Because Jose Gonzalez did not go to prison for what he did in that shower. Not for a night, not for a day. And to understand how that's possible, you have to look at the investigation that followed. An investigation that was, from its very first moments, a disaster. The scene was compromised almost immediately. Despite the fact that the locker room had been full of potential witnesses, few of them were interviewed thoroughly at the scene. The wrestlers, many of them foreigners far from home, wanted nothing more than to get off the island. And the wrestling business itself carried an ancient, powerful code, a code of silence. You did not talk to authorities, you did not expose the inner workings of the business. You did not cooperate with anyone who could bring the whole fragile structure crashing down. That code, meant to protect the business, now worked to protect a killer. Gonzalez's defense was simple. He claimed self-defense. He argued that Brody had come at him, that he had feared for his life, and that he had used the knife only to protect himself. And on the surface, to a jury who didn't know the full context, that story had a certain plausibility. After all, look at the size of the two men. Brody was a giant, a famous wild man with a reputation for real-life toughness and a stiff, dangerous style in the ring. Gonzalez was smaller. It was easy, if you squinted, to imagine the smaller man cornered by the larger one, striking out in desperation. But that story fell apart the moment you looked closely. Because Brody was unarmed. Brody was in the shower at Gonzalez's own invitation. Gonzalez was the one who had asked for the meeting. Gonzalez was the one who had brought a hunting knife into a locker room. The idea that the man who arranged the meeting and carried the weapon was the true victim strained belief to its breaking point. Gonzalez was arrested. He was charged initially with a serious count reflecting the gravity of what he had done. But he was released on bail that many considered shockingly low. And then, in a move that enraged the foreign wrestlers almost beyond words, he went right back to work. He wrestled, he booked. He walked the halls of the same promotion, in some cases the same buildings, as if a man had not just died at his hands. For many of the Americans, that was the final straw. They left the island. Some of them swore they would never work for the WWC again. And then came the trial. And the trial is where justice, already staggering, finally collapsed completely. It came down to witnesses. The prosecution's case depended on the men who had been closest to the scene. The men who could speak to what they had seen and, just as importantly, to the context that shredded the self-defense claim. The two most important of those witnesses were Tony Atlas and Dutch Mantell. Atlas had cradled the dying man in his arms. Mantell had been right there in the room. If anyone could stand before a jury and tell the truth of that night, it was these two. Neither of them testified. The reason has been debated for decades, but the men themselves have always been clear about it. They say they never received their subpoenas in time, that the summonses to appear were sent late or sent to the wrong places, arriving only after the trial had already concluded. Whether that was staggering incompetence or something more deliberate, the effect was the same. The two witnesses who could have destroyed the self-defense narrative were simply not in the room. Their voices were absent from the one place they mattered most. And so the jury heard Gonzalez's version largely unchallenged. They heard about the giant and the smaller man. They heard the story of a frightened wrestler defending his own life. And with the crucial counter-testimony missing, they reached their verdict. Not guilty, by reason of self-defense. Jose Gonzalez walked free. He returned to the ring. He continued to be a star and a booker for the promotion for years. And in a detail so cold, it barely seems real, the WWC would later actually incorporate the real-life killing into a wrestling storyline, building angles around the accusations against him. The death of a real man, a father, turned into content, into an angle, into a way to sell a few more tickets. For Barbara Goodish, left to raise an 8-year-old boy alone, there would be no closure, no conviction, no sense that the system had done right by her husband, just the crushing weight of a loss compounded by injustice. For years, she would search for answers, for accountability, for something that never came. And Tony Atlas has carried his own weight all these years. In one of the most haunting things ever said about this case, Atlas reflected that nothing could justify what happened that night. He said that Brody had only one person to stand up for him, and that every single day, when he looks in the mirror, he sees that person looking back. That is the story of the final 48 hours of Bruiser Brody, a man who left his family in Texas to earn a living the only way he knew how, and who never came home. A business dispute that should have ended in a handshake or, at worst, a heated argument, and instead ended in a shower stall with a knife. A chaotic, failed medical response that stole away the time that might have saved him. And a legal system that let the man who held the blade walk out of a courtroom a free man. But the story does not quite end in that Puerto Rican courtroom. Because Bruiser Brody, the man, was too big to be erased, even by an injustice this profound. In Japan, where they had loved him like few others, they held a memorial service inside a wrestling ring. And Barbara and young Jeff were there to receive the honor and the grief of an entire nation of fans. His influence spread across generations of wrestlers who came after him. The chaotic, brawling, unpredictable style he pioneered can be seen directly in the work of stars like Mick Foley, who has openly credited Brody as the model for his own career, and in the intensity of countless performers who studied the way that Giant could make a crowd believe. His stubborn independence, his refusal to be owned, foreshadowed a modern era in which wrestlers fight to control their own destinies rather than surrender them to a corporation. In 2019, more than 3 decades after his death, Bruiser Brody was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. It was a recognition long overdue, an acknowledgement that this man belonged among the immortals of the industry. Though even that moment carried a sting, as Barbara revealed she learned of the induction not through a phone call from the company, but by seeing it posted on social media. A final small indignity in a story full of them. That same year, the documentary series Dark Side of the Ring devoted an episode to the killing, titled Around the Death Itself. It brought the case roaring back into the public consciousness, featuring raw, emotional interviews with the men who were there. Tony Atlas, Dutch Mantel, Abdullah the Butcher. It even featured a confrontation with Jose Gonzalez himself, who maintained his innocence and refused to discuss the details on camera. For a new generation of fans who had never seen Brody work, it was an introduction to both the legend and the tragedy in the same breath. And that, perhaps, is the strange dual legacy of Frank Goodish. Within the wrestling business, there are 2 versions of his story that live side by side. One is pure tragedy, the tale of a beloved man taken far too soon, mourned by everyone who knew the truth of who he was. The other is a cautionary tale, a warning passed from veteran to rookie about the dangers of the road, about the places where the business could turn genuinely deadly, about the fact that not every locker room is a safe one and not every handshake is honest. He was the wild man who was secretly the gentlest of fathers, the uncontrollable brawler who was, in truth, the most disciplined businessman in the building, the independent spirit who answered to no one, brought down at last not in a fair fight, but by a knife hidden in a towel. In a private conversation he had every reason to believe was safe. Frank Goodish deserved better. He deserved a long life, a chance to watch his son grow up, a peaceful retirement far from the chains and the blood and the roar of the crowd. He deserved, at the very least, a system that would hold his killer to account. He got none of those things. What he got, in the end, was a legend that refused to die, kept alive by the fans who never forgot, and the family who never stopped fighting for his memory. The showers at that stadium in Bayamon have long since been torn down. The territory that ran so hot and so wild in 1988 is a shadow of what it was. The men who were in that locker room are old now, and some of them are gone. But the story remains. It remains because it has to. Because a man was killed in a room full of people, and the person who did it never spent a night behind bars, and the only way to honor a life like that is to refuse to let the truth be forgotten. Bruiser Brody came to the ring like a hurricane. He left it far too soon, and in a way no one who loved him could ever have imagined. But more than 3 decades later, we are still saying his name. And maybe that, in the end, is its own kind of justice. The kind that can't be voted on by any jury. The kind that lives in memory and refuses to fade. If you found this story worth telling, do us a favor. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments who you'd like us to cover next. Until then, remember the man behind the monster. Remember Frank Goodish.